Welcome everyone to the White Box again. I'm very glad you found your way to the second panel of Next Media Journalism. Well, when talking about public broadcasting stations, a lot of people are very quick to argue on how too big they are and what a difficult structure they have and all these things, especially when talking about the federal German ARD. Trust me, I know what I'm talking about there. And then usually comes the killer question. Well, if they would build it all from scratch again, would they do it exactly the same way? And I guess we can all agree that there's a very simple answer to that question. On the other hand, a lot more difficult to find is the answer to the question on how old media companies have to behave and what they have to change to remain powerful in the new era of next media journalism. Which channels do they have to build and what is out of their playing field? Among public broadcasting stations, the BBC has always been the one everybody has looked up to. And I think even with the latest scandals this year, this hasn't really changed because there was a lot of admiration on how hard they tackled the problems from inside. So even on that. I'm very glad we have the man here today who's responsible for the strategic work in the BBC and will tell us now how he and his team are answering that very question on how the BBC is looking forward to entering the next media stage. Jim Egan is head of global news and has been with the BBC since 2007. He was strategy director of the regulator Ofcom and had been with PricewaterhouseCoopers as well as the Sky B. So he also has a very lot of experience in the private field. Sorry. He now talks to us about the world's newsroom, BBC in the age of all you can watch. Please, Jim, take over.
Thank you, Anna, and guten Tag, meine Damen und Herren. Meine Abitur habe ich schon vor 25 Jahren gemacht, aber ich hoffe, Sie haben nichts dagegen, wenn ich ein paar Wörter auf Deutsch sage. Ich möchte Ihnen bedanken für die Einladung und auch für die Gelegenheit, Berlin noch einmal zu besuchen. I'm going to stop there. That was the most nerve-wracking bit, so I hope that was okay. I have an 11-year-old son who is just studying German. He's just starting German at school, and he was complaining to me about, why am I having to do this? You know, what's the use? And I said, it is useful. It is useful. And he said, I dare you. I dare you. So thank you for your understanding. Okay, let's get going. I'm going to talk about the BBC News, particularly the BBC's international news services that I'm responsible for. An important clarification at the outset is that although the BBC is publicly funded in the UK, outside the UK, everything that we do is commercially funded. So we have this curious dynamic going on in the organisation. But everything that I'm responsible for, which is the BBC World News Channel and BBC.com, that is all solely commercially funded. I'm going to talk a little bit about the BBC experience. I'm going to try to give some general observations to what I think is going on and why it's happening. I appreciate that there are 4 or 5 sessions happening right now, so as the airlines say, you have a choice, and I thank you for choosing this session, and I hope there's something of general interest and reflection for us all. The all-you-can-watch age, the digital media age, it's an exciting time, but it's also a time that is characterised by a degree of gloominess. Certainly that's the way lots of the debate is framed in the UK. And maybe that's because we're journalists or we're people interested in the business of journalism looking on the downside. And often I find people can be quite nostalgic for a simpler time when everything was rather more straightforward, whether we're from the newspaper or the broadcast world. Now, I'm not personally sure that such a golden age, as people in the UK like to call it, I'm not sure that golden age ever existed. But if it did, perhaps it looked something like this.
Television news organizer.
It often begins with a ringing telephone and a glance at the map. The news story is underway. Sometimes the story is in London, perhaps an interview with a newly arrived statesman, a job for a sound film camera. Just one of the filming assignments repeated many times a day, 7 days a week, at home and abroad. Often with BBC reporters who are part of the camera team in television news. Television news has developed in the tradition of BBC Sound News, linked closely with Broadcasting House and with the headquarters of BBC News at Egan House nearby.
Okay, you get the general idea. Was it a golden age? I'm not sure. It was filmed during the 1960s. People in England are often quite nostalgic about the 1960s, especially if you're a football fan. That was the last time we had a decent football team. But we're not here to talk about football, at least not right now. You saw at the end of the clip two buildings, Broadcasting House and Egan House, and this is how those buildings looked in Christmas time last year, just before we opened our new headquarters in London. And in a slightly classic British way, when we were developing new headquarters, rather than knock it all down, we applied for planning permission and we built a big extension. So what you have here is a huge glass. In effect, it's a horseshoe shape that links these two buildings together, and this is now the home of the BBC, both in the UK, and it's also our global headquarters as well, with about 6,000 people in the building, half of whom are journalists. But going back to this idea of nostalgia, I think a lot of the nostalgia is understandable, given how profound and rapid the changes have been over the last decade or so. And for some businesses, the change has been terminal, of course. I think particularly in sort of Internet 1.0, there was this very ironic situation where businesses in print or broadcast saw audiences starting to move online. They made their own expensive investments in online platforms, started to migrate those audiences online. But of course, because advertising CPMs, advertising prices were lower online than they were in print or broadcast, the irony was that the faster you made the transition, the faster you went out of business. And that was clearly an extremely difficult phase. But despite all that, and speaking as someone who's a recovering economist, there are opportunities and new avenues that the internet opens up. Much lower barriers to entry, distribution costs starting to drop towards zero, which for those of us operating internationally has been very helpful. The opportunity to access new audiences both at home and abroad in a much easier way. And if you're commercially funded, certainly online, much more rapid feedback about audience data and consumer usage patterns and so on. There was a famous quote about advertising, which was coined in the 1950s by someone called Viscount Rothermere, and he said, "Half of the money I spend on advertising is wasted." You may know how it ends. The problem is I don't know which half. And I think one of the things that the electronic digital age is bringing is an end to that waste of advertising, and although it's uncomfortable, it's economically inefficient and will be positive in the long run. So there's lots of change happening within the sector, but of course this change is just a microcosm of the booming changes happening around the world as globalization and digital media have come hand in hand with each other. And in the international news game, this is fundamentally important because it's driving interest in what's going on around the world and the significance of those events for people's everyday lives. I refer to this as the idea of what happens over there matters to me back here. And if you take a look at some of these stats here, I mean, they really are very, very striking that just in the last decade alone, global exports are up from $6 to $15 trillion. This year, it's expected that there will be 1 billion international holidays or business trips make. One or two of you in the room may feel that you're making your own significant contribution to that figure of 1 billion. And of the 7 billion people now on the planet, 1/4 billion are living in a country outside that of their birth. And if you look at the cost of doing business, I mean, these numbers are very striking, perhaps less so between 1930 and 1990, but the cost of a transatlantic call now is just 1/100th in 2013 what it was just 23 years ago. So there's lots of underlying economic, social, cultural change going on as well as business change. And it sort of leads you to ask the question, well, why is everyone so gloomy? Why aren't we a bit more optimistic about what's happening? And I think that part of the reason is to do with the difficulty that established businesses have had in making the transition and what has to be sacrificed to go from the linear world, the linear analog world, to the online connected world. And there's an Irish saying which sort of captures this idea. My wife is Irish, and she's also a very scary person. So I learned a long time ago not to do an Irish accent. But the proverb is in response to a traveller in Ireland who asks for directions. And the response is, well, if I wanted to get over there, I wouldn't start from here. And I think that's actually at the heart of a lot of the difficulties people have had, because migrating to the digital age involves reinventing business models. It involves new workflows and practices in the newsroom that are often very controversial to introduce. It sometimes involves not doing things that until very recently had actually made you a lot of money. And so perhaps it's no surprise in this context that it's the organisations with the least to lose that in many ways seem to have found it easiest over the last few years to make their way. I'm thinking of people like Huffington Post, Daily Beast, BuzzFeed, and so on, who are now starting from nothing. And BuzzFeed started 3 years ago, was profitable in a big announcement last week. Sometimes the longer your history and the more established you've been in the sector, the more difficult it is to endure. And this picture here, you will instantly recognise. I dare say very few of us in the room have bought one of these recently. And the name itself instantly brings to mind the company which was for so long the market leader in print film, Kodak, of course. And their story, although it's not directly in our sector, I think bears some retelling, because the demise had been a protracted one over the last couple of decades. And it's not as simple as there was a big incumbent industry dinosaur that didn't see change coming and got wiped out. It was actually rather more subtle than that. I mean, back in the early 1970s, Kodak saw the very beginnings of digital photography. They had lots of strategy teams working on what digital photography might mean. Quite famously, in 1975, one of their engineers, a guy called Steve Sussman, developed and produced the first prototype digital camera. And he took it along to one of the Kodak corporate boards and presented this device very proudly. And the response is quite famous, actually. The response of the chairman of this Kodak board said, "Steve, that's really, really cute, but whatever you do, don't tell anyone about it." Right? And in that, I think you have the heart of what was Kodak's problems, that really they were looking for updated ways of doing what they'd always done. And I don't think that's what the digital and internet media age is. And Kodak went through, they made big acquisitions, they tried to diversify, but all of it was variations on really quite a narrow theme. And they didn't seem to spot what organizations like Facebook and Flickr realized, that imaging and photography was rapidly becoming in the digital age. In the numbers, in the end, there's the conclusion that tells its own story. So in the same year that Kodak filed for Chapter 11 in the States, a company that had 145,000 employees, the same year, in effect, that Kodak went bust, Instagram, which had been around for a few months and had 13 employees, was sold for $1 billion. So what does all this have to do with the BBC? And you may even be asking, well, isn't the BBC just another Kodak waiting to happen? Slightly darker question. Predictably enough, my answer to that is emphatically no. But you know, we all go to lots of these conferences, and the one thing I really don't like is someone standing up and trumpeting their business successes and pretending to have all the answers to all of the questions. It is absolutely not the case at the BBC. And if I'm going to do one thing today, I hope to be a little bit honest that this is a very, very difficult journey, and it's a painful one that we are embarking on. But I think there's something really important at sort of the beginning of the strategy on all this, and that's the difference between staying true to the things that you've always believed in and the values that uniquely identify your organization. That, I think, is important. In fact, I think it's essential. But there's something different between believing what you believed in and doing what you always did. Right? And so for us at the BBC, I think our focus is on those values which positively define the BBC, but evolving our journalism in different and sustainable directions. And there are two elements to that I want to talk a little bit about. Multi-platform and multilingual. Now, multi-platform, not necessarily very interesting. I mean, we've all been to conferences over the last 10 years. People have been talking about multimedia and so on and so forth. But for me, there's a difference between many platforms and multi-platforms. I think there are lots of journalistic organizations now who have print or video and or online and or radio entities, but there are very few that are actually really integrating those in a way which allows you, rather than layering cost upon cost upon cost, to actually be spreading cost and spreading those stories across a number of different platforms. Now, in our multi-platform initiatives at the BBC, I do often get the challenge of, well, multi-platform has got nothing to do with journalism, it's just all about cost saving, isn't it? And I believe just as emphatically the answer to that is no. Fundamentally, multi-platform is about following the audience. And in journalism, if we're going to survive at all, it's being responsive to audience change that's at its very heart. So these are changes that we've all seen in our various guises around the world, but they're important to us both editorially and also commercially, given our business model. And earlier on this year, we conducted a study with 3,500 people in 9 countries around the world, including Germany, to find out a little bit more about these multi-platform habits. So I'm afraid it's graph time, but don't worry, there aren't 28 of these slides, there's just one, so it won't be too painful. But let me take you through just a selection of the numbers. So this picture here shows how people were consuming news. So this is very much among news consumers, consuming news during the day from morning to evening. And if we just go through the key up here, so up at the top we have televisions, next is PC, whether that's a desktop PC or a laptop. I should confess here, I'm colourblind, so this is where things slow down a little bit. You're going to have to help me out. I'm pretty sure this is orange, that's the tablet, and this one here, I've got no idea what that is, but that's the little one, and that's smartphones. So just to talk you through some of the more obvious things that you would see here, this line here is television following a relatively predictable usage curve during the day. So a little bit of a bump round about breakfast time. But television and television news very much still an evening time in engagement or pursuit. One thing which we found no evidence of was TV being in terminal decline. TV is very much still alive and in rude health as a platform for news, and we're looking at more of a coexistent world rather than one of new monsters eating the old monsters. And to illustrate that a bit more, I think the tablet line is quite interesting. Much lower consumption during office hours during the day, but also a bit of an evening peak for tablets as well. It seems to be emerging for news consumption as something that people are doing after work, at home, in the evening. And again, very coexistent with the TV. In fact, we found among tablet owners were watching more TV and getting more of their news from TV in terms of total hours than people without tablets. So tablets and TV seeming to go side by side. From a commercial point of view, most of the money over the last 5 years has been in the top two, TV and web. Lots of the audience shifts are on the bottom two here as well. And certainly among audiences, the evidence we found was that there is an expectation among audiences that advertising will be pretty much as present on those devices as it will on the more established devices of TV and PC display. And we've all seen over the last 6 months people like Facebook starting to monetize mobile successfully, CPMs remaining an issue, but nevertheless, this is the way the audience is moving, and I think faced with that, you've got a choice. You either go with them, or something much more uncomfortable happens in the long run. Let me talk a little bit about multilingual, because this is slightly different from multi-platform, and the two themes very much go together. Multi-platform is certainly something we've invested very, very heavily in. It's been expensive. That building that I showed you earlier was not cheap. Multilingual actually is less about investing in something and more about using something you already have. I'm not sure how many of you know a little bit, at least, about the BBC World Service, but we've been operating in languages other than English since the 1930s. But it wasn't actually deliberate, but it had the effect of really of banishment, really. That the language services were in a building called Bush House, which was on the eastern side of London, several miles away from where English language news was coming from. And really, it was just something that was underutilized. It played a very important role in its own framework. But one of the other really great things about the building has been moving all of these journalists together, speaking the 27 languages that they do, using the technology for packages and stories to move around across these platforms and also across the languages. And since we launched here in January, I've been personally very, very committed that when we're covering big stories such as Syria and Egypt, that's not all about white-faced, middle-aged guys talking in English about the story and working with our colleagues in the BBC Arabic service, in the Persian service, and so on. It just gives us credibility and authenticity, to be honest, in what we are trying to do. We call that building that I showed you earlier the world's newsroom, and it's a bit of a nickname for the building, but it's also the essence of an editorial idea that although we are proudly based in London, this is not British news for the world. But it's our attempt to report the most important, significant political, economic, cultural events around the world on behalf of the world's audiences. And I'll just try to illustrate that a little bit more in this next film.
Welcome to the world's newsroom here in the heart of London. For the first time ever, we've brought together our television, radio, and online news operations into one place, creating the most advanced digital broadcast and production facilities on the planet. This substantial investment in journalism has allowed us to create the world's largest multilingual, multi-platform news facility. Our news studios are bigger, sharper, and more dynamic than ever before, using the very latest high-definition technology. BBC journalists can now report on the news using state-of-the-art graphics and virtual reality, bringing to life stories from all over the world, or even the universe. With all our journalism in one place, we're able to capitalize on the expertise and knowledge of each of the BBC's 27 language services to deliver news to our global audience, wherever and whenever they want to consume it. More modern, more engaging, more effective. Welcome to the world's newsroom.
Okay, so the tone there is self-confident to the point of being slightly over the top, so forgive me for that. But hopefully you get the underlying idea, this importance of multi-platform and multilingual working together, staying true to the essence of the BBC, but doing things in different and ultimately very, very exciting ways. We are just at the beginning of the journey, as I said earlier, and I'm very happy in questions to talk about what we've done and also what we haven't done. This is a delicate transition, and I think one of the really important things about multi-platform is to be respectful of the craft skills that many of our journalists have established over a number of decades in radio, in TV, and so on. This isn't just telling everyone overnight you're all multimedia journalists now, forget everything that you know. The financial returns, such as they are hard to come by. I doubt even Jeff Bezos of Amazon will be expecting much return on his $250 million investment in the Washington Post anytime soon. But nevertheless, this stuff matters. It matters to us who have the privilege of working in this industry, and it matters to our audience. And my impression is that the audience is becoming more and more interested in the world around them and what it means for their everyday lives. And as a result of that, more than anything else, I'm optimistic. We saw a film there from the 1960s, and the world has changed almost beyond recognition since then. I'm sure it will change again over the next 50 years too, but who knows, here and now in 2013, we might even be entering another golden age. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Jim Egan, and I think we now have a small transition time for change of furniture. Okay. But I already like to announce if you have some questions coming up later on, please feel free to ask them. Until, yeah. Should I just put them up? Können wir noch ein Glas Wasser haben, bitte? Können wir noch ein Glas Wasser haben? So. Okay. Well, I think we can start talking already.
Yeah, it wasn't that complicated, was it?
No. Well, first of all, the merging of BBC World News and BBC News.com, I mean, that was probably a big adventure for the whole company. Do you think the obstacles in the mind of the people were harder to overcome than the actual change of structure, or what was the main problem there?
You know, organisational change is always controversial and so on. So just to explain some of the background, up until this time last year, in fact, BBC World News, the TV channel, and BBC.com were independent business entities within the BBC. So we brought them together last year, and yeah, there was a degree of controversy about it. Actually, I don't think it was that hard. I mean, to be honest, it's something arguably we should have done 10 years or so ago. But it depends at what level you're talking about the merger, I think, because, you know, within the same organisation you can put two profit and loss accounts and two balance sheets together, but that's not really a merger. I mean, you know, the profound sense of a merger is something that goes all the way from the correspondence in the field to your marketing execution and so on and so forth. And that's something where we're probably, how to describe this? So I think from a marketing point and a commercial point of view, the merger is very well effected. So all of our top 10 advertising clients are now advertising online as well as on TV. I think then if you go back through the journalism production chain, among the news gathering correspondents outside the UK, the merger is very, very well effected there, and they think and act instinctively now in a multimedia way. It's in the newsroom that there's still work to do.
When you say you could have done that already 10 years ago, do you think you lost important time there and somebody else took over, or some shares which you could have gained?
I think, you know, it would have been an idea before its time, literally 10 years ago. We could have done it 5 years ago for sure, and, you know, part of me wishes that we had. By the same token, you know, are there more people working in a more profound multi-platform way than we are at the BBC? There probably are, but I don't see too many of them.
Speaking about news as a product, you still believe in news as really a product you can sell for 10 years also, or do you sometimes have doubts that news is something which is now available everywhere online, on Twitter and on Facebook, and so it's hard to compete?
It's a good question. I think one of the interesting things that's happened over the last decade or so is, yeah, for sure, there are many, many more places you can get your news from. You know, we are all sport for choice for news sources. Actually, there aren't that many more people reporting the news, certainly not internationally. I mean, my observation is that, you know, lots of the big, most famous American newspapers have been closing their bureau. Correspondent bases are smaller now, and so on. So, you know, we, partly by virtue of our dual funding, publicly funded in the UK, commercially funded internationally, we're trying to make a point of strength from the fact that we have journalists in more countries than anybody else. There is an end user hunger for the news. In the end, it has to be paid for somehow. And right now we are just about managing to pay our way commercially. But I think, as all of us in the room know, there are easier ways of making a buck.
You're one of the very few organizations in the world, I think, in journalism who are still opening up new correspondent bureaus in Asia and other places. Is that a strategic investment, or is that something which you say as a public broadcasting station you have to do because of public interest and because nobody else
look, I think the honest answer is a bit of both. So, you know, there is domestic interest in the UK in having a well-resourced network of journalists. And that's a public broadcasting argument, but there is also a commercial argument for it as well. And, you know, we have been running, not just here in Germany, but globally, a marketing campaign, which we call Live the Story. It's all about the fact that we do have the benefit of journalists, both in English and also these other languages, who are on the ground. You know, I don't think anybody else has 100 correspondents in Africa, for example. And that's something that I think is to our commercial strategic advantage, as well as having a public media argument in support of it as well.
Your people work all over the world, in South Africa and Asia and everywhere. How do you integrate them in your new multimedia strategy? How do you get them in the same boat? I mean, I imagine it's difficult if they're all far away and you have to do that via email.
This is another part of the journey, okay? Because you can go to any major city in the world, and there isn't just one BBC office. You know, there's 3 or 4 of them. It drives us absolutely mad, because we have this history of people behaving in a slightly narrow-minded kind of silo type way. So that is, from a real estate point of view, that is a journey that we are on. I think. The integration starts a lot in the planning, and this is something where we are now planning on a multimedia footing from the outset of a story. As I said earlier, the correspondents themselves are now filing in a multimedia way. We've been investing a lot in the language skills of our journalists so that we have a cadre of people who can report in English or Russian or Persian or Arabic and so on. But in the newsroom in London, in that building that I showed earlier, the majority of people there are probably still working on radio or TV or online or user-generated content or whatever. So we have the underlying technology in place for packages and material to be shared, but that's where the further integration needs to happen.
And would you say, in general, it's very important to do the planning in London or in the Home Office, and to tell people exactly what they have to do in order to come up with a great multimedia?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it matters so much where it happens, as long as you only plan it once.
And not many people are planning it differently at different places.
We do have, there are some big bases. So Washington DC is very big for us. Singapore is big, Delhi is big, and so on. But London is certainly the headquarters.
Well, you worked, as I mentioned earlier, also for PricewaterhouseCoopers and BSkyB. Do you find journalists extremely keen on, you mentioned that in your keynote as well, foreseeing their own doom and being a little bit whimsy about change in general?
Yes, but not in a way that I find disheartening. I think there's an important difference between cynicism and skepticism.
Okay.
That a good journalist is a skeptic, either by birth or certainly by training.
Let me follow you with an open question.
Yeah.
What do you do to overcome that attitude? I mean, how can you motivate your people?
Yeah, well, hopefully I touched on it a little bit earlier. I think it's that audience perspective that is really, really key. And if you look at some of the numbers, for example, about 2 years ago, our audience was, among digital audience, it was 85% desktop PC and 15% mobile. By the end of this year, it will be 50-50. So, you can come up with a strategically flashy-sounding mobile-first strategy idea, but when you have that sort of evidence of dramatic and radical audience change, that's normally the best way of winning the argument.
Do you think it's...
I'm going to take this off if you don't mind.
Sure.
Do you mind?
No. Do you think it's important to engage the audience as well, to really take them on the journey while you're developing a strategy for a multimedia project or something, to ask them on what questions they find interesting and all this, or is that a little bit overrated? Because everybody's talking about this now.
I don't think meaningful audience feedback is ever overrated. I think you can overdo it sometimes, and in the end, part of the job of the professional journalist is to make editorial choices and so on. But we have a panel of about 10,000 people, we call it BBC Global Minds, that we're regularly asking about our schedule or new programs and so on and so forth. Social media is very, very important for us, both as a news gathering and also a news dissemination tool. And UGC also has a slightly nuanced role, but UGC is important.
Do you have one channel which you think is the most important one for feedback, for social media, Twitter, Facebook? Do you have a ranking there?
I think it's mainly about Twitter and Facebook. So we work a little bit with other social media platforms. But you know, we're very proud to be. We are the most retweeted news source on the web. And I think when someone shares a story, they are implicitly saying something about the trustworthiness and reliability of that story. So Twitter is important for us. I mean, we do have a big Facebook following, but I think as something that feels more like a journalistic tool and has that kind of raw, right up to the minute sort of dynamic to it, Twitter is probably the one.
We had the German CEO of Twitter here yesterday, Ron Barnett, and he mentioned, or he actually had a very nice graphic where you could see that as soon as the BBC enters the Twittering, it becomes one of the largest, news distributors. I mean, even though some people who were at the place where something happened might be at the beginning faster, but then as soon as the BBC enters, it takes over. Is there a certain strategy for that as well, that you say, okay, we have to get the things right first, and then we get in and we get in big? Or how do you do that?
Well, the general strategy for us is be right rather than being first. Although I have to say, I don't think we're bad at being first, particularly from certain parts of the world that other broadcasters are less good at covering. But that is the general overall strategy, while at the same time, you know, being current and immediate on, you know, certainly a breaking news story and something that's unfolding, such as the Boston bombings earlier on this year, or Egypt last month. Social media is very important. Our journalists particularly our stable of 6 or 7 correspondents that we're presenting really as the face of the channel. We encourage and we urge them to use social media as much as possible. The editorial rules and guidelines around that are quite strict, and you have to be careful, but in the end you have to make it interesting as well.
But on the other hand, it's always for a public broadcasting station. I mean, how funny can they be? How witty? It's always difficult to tell. How do you? What do you tell them?
Well, one way of telling is by counting the number of followers.
Oh, okay. Numbers again.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure a lot of people in this room are familiar with the snowfall story the New York Times did, and I think it was a brilliant example on how you can really do the multimedia thing everybody is talking about. Why did a newspaper was setting this example? Wouldn't it have been better for a big public broadcasting station as the BBC to come up with something like that?
Very good question, and you know, one we've asked ourselves once or twice. I mean, Snowfall was absolutely beautiful. I mean, you know, epic in its editorial execution, and I'm sure for a long time we will be looking back at that as the beginning of that sort of, you know, visually led, deep narrative sort of storytelling piece. I mean, to an extent, because of its focus around photojournalism, although that's important for us, it's not something we really lead on. But the visual nature of journalism, the visual web, is a really important theme. So we've been doing some things over the last 12 months. So, for example, London Olympics last year, we produced a really nice visual infographic piece which allowed people to enter their vital statistics, so height, weight, and so on and so forth. And you were returned with an idea of which Olympic athlete would you be, or who do you most closely resemble. Now, that sort of thing is interactive, it's participative, it's slightly light-hearted by its nature, but that was one of the most successful things for us last year. I mean, it's nothing in comparison to Snowfall, but the visual journalism is certainly going to be more important.
What I found most remarkable about that was actually that they gave some people the time, I mean months, to do the research and to... Do you still have the resources to give people that time?
On very rare occasions, I think, perhaps for an investigative story or something, but I think there are lots of journalists, not just in the BBC, but lots of other organisations who would have dearly loved to have been given that project. Yeah.
I mean, don't you think that especially the public broadcasting stations have that responsibility to do that? Because, I mean, they are funded in a different way. They could actually, well, they can say, we have the money, we can do it.
I'm not sure if it's responsibility so much, but I mean, from time to time, I guess it's perhaps an opportunity for them to do that sort of thing. Yeah.
Well, in my public broadcasting station, the NDR, very often also discuss the other part of the world. I mean, in Germany, we still have 20%. We call the offliners who are not in the internet. And do you think there's a risk to leaving them behind? I mean, they are paying customers as well. I imagine in Great Britain it's a similar question.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't directly my area because working in the international domain, you know, people in the audience for what I'm responsible for, you know, they are connected, and that's the presumption. But I think in the UK we are at a similar sort of level, that there is about 20% of people who are still unconnected, and it's sort of that's hard, I think, for a lot of people to imagine, and I think that becomes dangerous as a public broadcaster if you can't even imagine someone being unconnected. And the BBC is playing a small role in broadband rollout in rural areas and parts of the UK, and so on and so forth. A lot of this is the media literacy type debate and so on. But as there is more and more choice coming from the private sector, I do expect that the public intervention argument will go to places like, what do you do to help connect and bring online that sort of 20%, and that's one of the debates that starting to run in the UK.
As you work in more than 200 countries, and you also do studies in these countries on how they use tablets and how they use second or even third screen, what is your insight on how different countries are? Which are the first adopters and which are fairly late?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing I reflect on in travelling around is that the idea of developed and developing countries in the media sector is starting to break down very, very, very quickly. You know, I talked a little bit about mobile first earlier, but if you look in markets like India, like Sub-Saharan Africa, like many parts of Southeast Asia, people's first experience of the internet is a wireless one, and actually, that's a very modern notion, and it's quite hard for some of us who've grown up being used to desktop PC online usage. Actually, that's a difficult transition for us to make from the so-called developed to the so-called developing world. And so, you know, there are obviously, you know, purchasing power is different. The penetration build out of pay TV systems is different actually, but the internet is having this, you know, powerful democratizing and enabling force.
And in terms of revenues, which are the easy developed countries there?
There are no easy countries in news, none whatsoever. You know, over the last 5 years, there is a bit of a natural hedge in our business because things have been so difficult in Europe and to some extent the US that a lot of the growth in Asia has helped to keep us going. Latin America is a part of the world that I think in the UK, and dare I say in Europe, I think we understand not particularly well. And Latin America is definitely moving in interesting ways and also financially in interesting ways. But no, there's nowhere easy.
I think you once said you're planning with a growth rate of 25% for the next, I don't know, 10 years or something. Isn't that a little bit high-pitched? I mean, do you set the goal high? So
okay, so let me talk about that a bit more. The 25% is an increase in our editorial budgets, partly as a result.
Okay, just on the budget, not on the...
enabled by moving in there. Over 5 years, we are hoping to grow by 40% in total.
40?
Yeah, 40. So it's you know, it's a challenging business plan. Difficult for us to execute. It involves striking a delicate balance between the pay TV operators that we work with so closely over the last 20 years, investing in TV everywhere, authenticated, connected TV apps and so on, that are good for our business and good for theirs, while also exploring, you know, other sources.
But I mean, I guess the real challenge is that you have to finance that by yourself. I mean, I don't know if everybody knows that, but your part is not financed by the BBC.
We're not publicly funded, no. So we have to live by our means. There is one other very, very important difference though. Which is I don't have a profit maximizing target. So I don't have a group of shareholders every 3 months who are saying, what's the share price looking like? I don't have to declare a dividend every year. So for sure, I'm not allowed to lose money. And let's be clear about that. But my job is to grow revenues, and as a result of growing revenues, reinvest in the editorial product and break even.
Mm-hmm. Are there already some questions on the floor, maybe? Yeah, there's one. Wait a second for the mic. Thank you.
On your one chart that you showed, radio does not appear at all. Is that being discounted completely, phased out? Or?
Let me, I'm sorry, I'm going to get into the depths of BBC org structures a little bit to answer that question. So as Anna was saying just now, everything that we do is commercially funded. Actually, radio and the BBC's international radio services are still publicly funded for reasons better explained by history rather than economics and so on. Intriguingly, the one exception to that is here in Berlin, actually, where we are fortunate to have an FM frequency for BBC World Service Radio, and we've been trialling the use of adverts on that network for the last 12 months. So I don't directly work in radio, but I work very closely alongside the people from the World Service. And my personal experience is, I think, audio is in rude health. I think audio has benefited from the internet and the all-you-can-listen-to age actually rather earlier than TV, whether that's our own sort of personal experience of TuneIn or Spotify or whatever. So audiences for BBC International Radio continue to grow rather than go down. It happens to be publicly funded, but I think radio has also quite a promising future.
Thank you. There's another question there. Okay.
You are a very important international news broadcaster, but you have several competitors. Mm-hmm. What do you think about the competitors? What's the USP of BBC World comparison to the competitor?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's it's a great question. It sort of goes back to that golden age idea, because in the golden age it was much easier to answer the question, who are your competitors? So it's a very difficult set for us now. So in the US, which is by far our biggest market online, we are competing with the US domestic operators as well as some of these new entrants like BuzzFeed and so on. But I think the answer to who are our competitors is more along the lines of CNN, Al Jazeera, Sky News, to some extent Russia Today, France 24, and so on. One thing we are not is we are not a British take on international events, and unlike Die Deutsche Welle here, that actually has a remit to sort of project and encourage an understanding of Germany around the world. We do not have that remit. In fact, we only run British stories on BBC World News if we're convinced that they are of global resonance and so on, which doesn't always make me popular domestically. I quite often have British MPs who want to know why we don't have more county cricket scores on BBC World News and so on. And I say, well, that's not the point of the channel. So that international, that sort of geographically impartial perspective is something that's very, very important to us, that we are not in business to try to convince people of the British way of seeing the world. And the other point of difference is that we are a commercial entity within a public enterprise. So I don't have to maximize profits. I don't have to return a dividend. In the end, we have the good fortune, but also the challenge of solely being responsible to the audience, and that is a privilege. It's a distinguishing factor. But like I said before, nothing is easy.
But still, you would say you don't really have. I mean, I take it don't really tough competitors on the field.
Oh no, for sure. I mean, there are. It's slightly curious that despite all the difficulties that many of the commercially funded guys have had over the last 10 to 20 years, lots of people are moving into international journalism. So, we all know about Al Jazeera, a successful decade for them. They were able to spend $500 million on buying Current TV to launch their own channel there. They're spending a month in the US what my total global marketing budget is. The Iranians have launched Press TV quite recently. The Japanese have an NHK World. The Chinese are resourced in a way that I can only dream about. So there are more people turning up. There is a lot more entry into this market. But it seems that the people who are turning up tend to have more state backing than commercial backing these days.
Please.
You mentioned earlier in passing the nuanced role of user-generated content. I wonder if you could just explain a bit more about the nuance. I mean, I'm particularly referring to the inclusion, shall we say, of Facebook comments in news reporting on the BBC, particularly in the World Service.
So the reason why I use the word nuance is that I think when UGC first started breaking through and having an impact some years ago, I think lots of people were saying, is this the end of professional journalism? We just hand it over to the citizens and they can do what they like. I think we are moving on to a different interpretation of UGC now. We use user-generated content a lot. I mean, on a busy news day, we will have up to 10,000 emails coming in, which may be including pictures or footage. And audiences, I think, are becoming quite accustomed to on a break, if there's a human tragedy or a natural disaster and so on, they are used to seeing user-generated content first. So that's one thing. And another role that UGC plays is sometimes helping us decide what not to show as well as what to show. So there was a story about 6 weeks ago of someone being buried alive in Syria, which had been sent in to us. Actually, thanks to the UGC contributions we also had, we were able to conclude that that was a concocted event and something that we didn't run, despite the fact some others did. Facebook comments and so on, I regard that as part of audience interaction, and audience participation is something that has a more richer potential now. We're doing a live broadcast in the Historische Museum tomorrow of World Have Your Say, which is our weekly audience participation show. What's the role of Germany and Europe and the world in the run-up to the federal elections and so on. And that's a modern take on an old sort of phone-in idea. I don't think the fact that someone's contributed an idea on Facebook rather than by phone necessarily rules it out. But yeah, you do have to be measured in your use of this, for sure.
So you're saying the storytelling is still, in a way, the same, it's just the channels they come through change?
Yeah, we're all, in the end, we're still in the business of storytelling, but absolutely that storytelling and perspectives on events can be enhanced by the participation of audience members, particularly if you're able to do that by polling views of people who are speaking a variety of different languages around the world, who are able to debate some of the most difficult issues of the day, despite the fact they can't actually speak to each other through automated translation and so on. I think that's very exciting.
Okay, still 2 questions, yeah? I think 2 are fine. Is there another one? 3, okay, last one.
We have different kind of journalism. We have the breaking news and we have background informations. How do you use the new technology and the new channels or platforms to cope the covering of breaking news and giving background informations to the audience?
Yeah, well, that's a hard one. So I'll talk about it a little bit. So for breaking news, journalists in the field now have a set of rules about what they report. So they're filing, in the first instance, probably a story of fewer than 150 characters, which can be reused for tweeting or text message alerts and so on and so forth. They're then doing something very, very short for the web, and then starting to do pieces for camera and so on. So this is this sort of integrated multi-platform mindset of news gathering correspondence in the field. On background stories, I think it really depends on the story in question. There are some, well-established tools of the trade that simply aren't going away. I'm a very ardent believer in the enduring role and remit of professional journalism, but people have a number of different resources that they're able to use, and on balance, I regard that as a good thing.
Sorry, I think this one before that one, yeah.
You said that you now plan major stories as a multi-platform endeavor from the start. Do you have some good examples of what specific experiments have worked well, or how you do that, how journalists have to work or can work differently as a consequence of that?
Yeah, well, you know, a simple trite example is, you know, all too often there may have been a presidential news conference and sort of 12 people from the BBC would turn up, and, you know, that is starting to happen less. I wouldn't say it's been totally eradicated. But I think it's both on sort of planned events around elections, but also unfolding and developing stories where we're getting much better. So even since, you know, if we can remember back that far, the start of the Arab Spring in 2011, what we're doing and the way we are using a sort of project-based working, which is sort of taken from the business world a little bit, to say this is a massive story, it's clearly going to run for the next few months, and we get people from radio, TV and online, from a number of our relevant language services. We use our colleagues in BBC Monitoring, which is an open source monitoring outlet that we have up in Caversham. We're able to execute those stories in a way which is much more rounded, has a variety of perspectives to it, and has in the end to be a lot more efficient than having 6 or 7 pockets of teams working on the same story but never talking to each other.
Last question over there.
You've described how you've created this one news operation, but also that you're serving 2 different segments of the market, namely the UK market and the rest of the world. Now, when it comes to the BBC's public service obligations and its remit, how do you balance it out, the one against the other? And which one of the 2 is driving the BBC's news business? Is it the commercial considerations or its public service remit?
Very good question. I think we try to flip it around the other way, so that the editorial values and the standards of anything that has BBC News on it, whether it's publicly or commercially funded, is exactly the same. And I think, you know, you look at it from a business person's point of view, that has to be right. If you had a different association with BBC News outside the UK than inside the UK, that would be extremely damaging. The 2 sources of funding do, in the end, create a bigger pot of money that we're able to spread over a number of different outlets, and that, by and large, is an advantage. There are on occasions where there will be a trade-off. So, you know, if you have an exclusive with, you know, a certain politician, you know, who gets it first, and so on. Those things come up from time to time. By virtue of the technology that we're working now, everything's shareable. You shouldn't be having zero-sum resource allocations decisions too often. But in the end, if it's a question of, is this driven editorially or is it driven commercially, it has to be driven editorially rather than commercially. But there is a balancing act there between UK and international expectations and so on. And, you know, it's something that we work with every day. But I'd rather have to do that balancing act than not have that richness of resources to deploy.
Well, I think we've come to the end. Thank you very much, Jim Egan, for coming over to Germany. And I found it not only interesting, your thoughts and your perspective on the topic, but I'm also taking a positive attitude if somebody's talking about growth rates of 40% or even 25%. I mean,
ask me in 5 years.
That's something to say about the industry. Thank you very much, and thank you for your attention.
Thanks for having me.